Most people think they already know what Canaan means, a promised land flowing with milk and honey. Heaven, right. But what if I told you Canaan is not heaven at all? What if Spurgeon revealed something so bold, so unsettling, that it could completely transform how you see the Christian life right now? Stay with me, because the truth about Canaan will not only surprise you, it might set you free. We've heard the songs and sermons that compare crossing the Jordan to dying, as if Canaan is the place we reach when we finally leave this world. But Charles Spurgeon didn't see it that way. He said something much deeper. Canaan is not the end of the journey, it's the beginning of a new kind of living. Canaan represents spiritual rest, not after death, but in the life of faith here and now. It's what happens when we stop striving, stop fearing, and start believing that Christ is enough, not just for salvation, but for every breath, every step, every burden. Think about it. Many believers today aren't living in Egypt anymore, but they haven't entered Canaan either. They're wandering in the wilderness, saved but unsure, forgiven but restless, hopeful yet heavy. Spurgeon called this the place between bondage and blessing, where doubt and fear still cloud the skies. But there's more. He described Canaan as a land that drinks water from heaven, not from the work of your foot. In Egypt, you labor endlessly to control your life. In Canaan, you receive. You live from what God sends, not from what you make happen, but from what flows from above. And that changes everything. Canaan isn't about waiting until you die. It's about stepping into a reality where your soul rests today, where your heart trusts, where your strength comes from surrender. So if you've been weary, if you've been trying to hold it all together, maybe what you need isn't more effort but deeper faith. Maybe your Canaan is closer than you think. Let's go further, because this revelation might be the turning point you didn't even know you needed. Spurgeon draws a powerful contrast between Egypt and Canaan, not just as places but as spiritual conditions. Egypt was dry, hard, and demanding. It relied on human effort. Fields were watered by foot, not by rain. Every blessing had to be forced. Nothing came easily. It was all sweat, all strain, and no rest. But in Canaan, everything changed. Canaan is described as a land of hills and valleys that drinks water from the sky. It doesn't need your feet, it needs your faith. Spurgeon said that the believer who enters Canaan is no longer living by effort alone, but by grace, by trust, and by divine provision. That's what makes this revelation so urgent. Because too many Christians are still living like they're in Egypt, even after salvation. They try to earn peace through performance. They exhaust themselves in religious duty as if God's love must be maintained like a fragile fire. But in Canaan, you stop earning. You start abiding. Spurgeon wasn't preaching a message of laziness. He was preaching freedom, not the absence of activity but the presence of trust. He quoted the psalmist saying, "God gives his beloved sleep." Not anxiety, not fear, not a race to prove your worth, just rest, the kind that lets you breathe again. How often do we live as if everything depends on us? We wake up worried, we go to bed exhausted, we think the outcome of our lives rests on how well we control the details. But that's not Canaan, that's Egypt in disguise, and the tragedy is, many believers never leave it. Spurgeon shared a story of a man who gave everything to succeed, sacrificing joy, health, even his family, only to realize that all he gained was empty. The world had promised him rest after the climb, but it never came, and it never will. True rest isn't at the top of the mountain. It's not after the next job or relationship or breakthrough. It's in the rain that falls on both the hills and the valleys. It's in the presence of a God who says, "You don't have to force what I already promised to provide." That's the Canaan Spurgeon was talking about. A land where grace flows, where striving ends, where you stop chasing and start trusting. There are believers who live years without a single doubt about their salvation, not because they are perfect, not because life is easy, but because they've crossed the line from fear into faith. They've stopped asking, "Am I enough?" and started resting in the one who is. Spurgeon called them the ones who have entered into rest. They don't walk on eggshells with God. They walk with Him daily, calmly, deeply. Their confidence is not in their feelings but in His promises. They don't try to earn His approval anymore. They live from it. These believers have learned to lie still in His hands and say, "Your will, not mine." They don't panic when the storm rolls in. They've discovered what it means to feast on the good grain of Canaan, the solid, satisfying food of assurance, not the flaky manna of the wilderness, but the deep nourishment of knowing you belong. Can you imagine that kind of peace? Waking up and knowing that even if everything around you collapses, God's love for you does not move. That your position in Christ is not tied to your performance. That the eyes of the Lord are upon you, from the beginning of the year to the end. Spurgeon believed that Canaan was not a perfect place, but a watched one. It's not without hills, not without valleys, but every corner of it is seen and cared for by God Himself. The rain comes not by accident but by appointment. Your joy, your strength, your provision, they're not random, they're sent. That's why Canaan is not a fantasy. It's not some unattainable ideal. It's a real spiritual place, a reality that begins the moment you stop living like everything depends on you. So many Christians spend years in the wilderness, not because they're not saved, but because they haven't yet learned to rest, to trust fully, to let go. And the truth is, until we do, we'll keep walking in circles, hopping for peace but never entering it, hopping for joy but never holding it, saved but still thirsty. But the moment you step into Canaan, something shifts. You stop chasing your identity and start receiving it. You stop praying for peace like it's far off and start living from the peace you already have. This is the life Spurgeon preached, not just saved from Egypt, but settled in Canaan. Canaan isn't flat. It's a land of hills and valleys, and that's not just geography, it's theology, because God's care isn't limited to the low places. He waters the heights too. Spurgeon made it clear, in Egypt the people depended on the Nile. When it didn't flood, they had nothing. They had to force life into the land, through systems, through labor, through their own effort. But Canaan drinks from the sky. The rain falls on the peaks and into the depths, and it falls when God commands it, not when we demand it. This is a radical kind of comfort, because it means even your most difficult seasons are not dry by accident. The high points of life aren't the only places where blessing flows. The valleys, too, are drenched with purpose. The believer who has entered Canaan understands this. They don't panic when life rises up into hills they can't climb. They don't curse the valleys when they come. They know that their land is alive because God sends the rain. Have you ever felt like you're standing on a steep hill of sorrow, or sitting in a shadowed valley of confusion? In Canaan, you're not alone in either, because God's eyes are on the entire landscape, every corner of your heart, every angle of your journey. He sees it all. Spurgeon said the difference between the worldling and the believer is this: the world depends on the ground, the believer depends on heaven. That's why the same trial that breaks one person strengthens another. Because the believer knows the source. They see mercy in the storm. They find purpose in the pain, not because they're stronger, but because they've learned to look up, not down. And that's what it means to live in Canaan. You're no longer at the mercy of the world system. You're rooted in something higher. You can say, "Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me." That's the language of someone who has stepped into a land that drinks from the rain of heaven. Someone who trusts that God is as present on the mountaintop as He is in the depths. Someone who no longer doubts if God is watching, but knows He never looked away. Spurgeon said something that many overlook: God doesn't just care for His people. He cares for their place. Not just for Israel, but for Canaan. Not just for your soul, but for your situation. That changes everything. Because the moment you become a child of God, your reality shifts. You're no longer a servant in Egypt. You're not just a wanderer in the wilderness. You are an inheritor in a land that God Himself watches, personally, constantly, intimately. The eyes of the Lord are upon your Canaan from the beginning of the year to the end. That means nothing touches your life without passing through His hands. Not the loss, not the delay, not even the silence. It's all seen, all known, all held. Can you feel the weight of that? Every joy you've tasted, every disappointment you've carried, He's watched it all unfold. Not as a distant observer, but as a faithful Father. Not with passive sympathy, but with purposeful intention. That's what makes Canaan so holy. It's not the absence of hardship. It's the presence of divine attention. It's not that the land is perfect, but that the God who sees it never looks away. While the world builds its life on systems and strategies, you build yours on a Savior who governs your ground. Spurgeon said the beasts of the field are now in league with you. The stones are at peace with you. Why? Because your land is under divine surveillance, because your storms are measured, because your blessings are timed. This is not spiritual fantasy. It's the deepest kind of reality. The Christian who lives in Canaan knows that his daily bread is not just earned, but given. He sees heaven's signature on every mercy. Every drink of water, every open door, every moment of peace carries the fragrance of God's hand. And that awareness changes how you live. You stop chasing control. You stop living like the outcome depends on you. You stop fearing the drought because your eyes have adjusted to see the clouds. Faith begins to rise, not because everything is easy, but because everything is seen, watched, cared for. In Canaan, you live under the gaze of a God who has never missed a moment. Canaan isn't just a place of rest, it's a place of transformation. When a believer finally enters into that space of full trust, where striving ends and surrender begins, something shifts deep inside. You're no longer living for peace, you're living from it, and that changes the way you speak, think, and walk through the world. Spurgeon spoke of those who have come into such a union with Christ that they lie passive in his hands, with no will but his. Not out of weakness, but out of absolute confidence. They've tasted what it means to truly abide. These aren't believers who live for mountaintop experiences or spiritual highs. They live steady, rooted, not because life is perfect, but because grace is enough. They've stopped asking, "What do I need to fix?" and started asking, "What do I need to release?" And when the trials come, and they will, these hearts don't collapse. They don't look to rivers on the ground. They look to the sky. They remember they're in a land that drinks from heaven. This is the mark of a Canaan-dwelling believer. They're not afraid of the hills anymore. The high places don't intimidate them. The valleys don't destroy them, because they know who sends the rain. They've moved from anxious effort to quiet trust. This doesn't mean they sit back in laziness. No, they work, but they no longer carry the burden of outcome. They've handed that over. Their obedience is real, but their rest is deeper. They live in motion, but with peace, because they know their strength is not in how hard they try, but in how freely they trust. It's a strange kind of power, the kind that doesn't look like power at all. It looks like gentleness, like stillness, like peace that passes understanding. That's what Canaan brings. Not just a different life, but a different spirit. Not just new surroundings, but a renewed heart. A heart that no longer panics when the clouds gather, but waits with hope, because it knows who commands the rain. The eyes of the Lord your God are always upon it, from the beginning of the year even unto the end. That single line held deep meaning for Spurgeon, and it should for us too. Because it means your life hasn't been a collection of random moments. Every gain, every loss, every joy and ache, he saw it all. From January's first breath to December's last sigh, his gaze never left. Some of you carried heavy grief this year. Others felt the sting of loss, of dreams delayed, of relationships broken, of stability shaken. Some of you felt forgotten, maybe even by God. But you were. Not for a second. Spurgeon didn't pretend every season was easy, but he insisted that every season was watched, and that's a mercy worth holding on to. The Christian in Canaan can look back over a year filled with hills and valleys and still say, "Surely goodness and mercy followed me." Not because it all made sense, but because God never stopped caring. His eyes never closed. That truth isn't just comforting, it's anchoring. It gives weight to every prayer you whispered through tears. It gives meaning to the waiting, to the silence, to the nights you couldn't sleep. None of it slipped past his view. And if he's seen you through this year, he'll see you through the next. That's what the believer in Canaan learns to believe. Not just that God loves us, but that he is present. Not just that he hears our cries, but that he walks with us in the quiet too. That even when it seems like nothing is changing, his hand is holding everything in place. Spurgeon reminded his church to look back, to see how God had expanded their borders, increased their strength, brought them safely through. Not because they were strong, but because God was faithful. And you too can do that now. Look back, trace the rain, feel the soil of your life and see where grace made it grow. Because the same God who watered your January will be faithful in your December. Spurgeon didn't just speak this message to individuals, he spoke it to the church. Because he believed Canaan wasn't just a personal experience, it was a corporate calling, a shared testimony of a people who had seen the hand of God again and again. He reminded his congregation that they had been through much, that they had grown, that their borders had been stretched, their numbers multiplied, and none of it happened by chance. He said, "We have not labored with our feet, we have not manipulated emotions, we have simply stood under the rain." and God had sent it faithfully, fully in His time. That's the same call today. We don't need performance. We don't need hype. We need heaven's rain. We need the steady downpour of truth and grace falling on a people who are willing to wait for it, trust it, and live in it. Maybe this year you felt small. Maybe your spiritual life felt dry, your prayers faint, your worship tired. But if you are still here, still listening, still longing, then hear this. You have not been forsaken, you've been seen, watched, watered. Even if you didn't feel it, the rain was falling. Maybe not all at once, maybe not where you expected, but every drop was measured and none were wasted. And now, as you stand on the edge of another year, you don't have to fear what's ahead, because the God who watched your yesterday already holds your tomorrow. That's the beauty of life in Canaan. It doesn't mean easy, but it means secure. It means stepping into each new season with the confidence that your land is still under His eye, that your soul is still within His hand. Spurgeon called it a miracle. That any Christian remains faithful is a miracle. That any church stays true is a miracle. And he wasn't wrong. Because we are not strong enough on our own. But God is faithful enough for us all. So now you've heard it. Canaan is not heaven. It's not a distant place beyond the clouds. It's a spiritual reality you can enter today if you'll trust Him fully. Not a life free from trouble, but a life free from fear. Not a land without hills or valleys, but one where rain still falls because God still sees. Spurgeon didn't offer a fantasy. He offered something far more real, rest. The kind that holds you when everything else shakes. The kind that frees you from the slavery of self-effort and draws you into the arms of grace. Maybe you've wandered long enough. Maybe you're tired of circling the same wilderness of doubt, fear, and striving. You've come out of Egypt. But you don't have to stop there. There's more. There's Canaan. And it's waiting. Not someday. Now. So take that step. Not with your feet, but with your faith. Let the rain fall where you are. Let God water what your hands can't reach. Let go and let Him bring you in. If this spoke to you, if your heart felt something awaken, don't let the moment pass. You're not alone. Others are coming into Canaan too. Let this message be the beginning of that journey. Subscribe to the channel, not because of an algorithm, but because this space is your invitation to keep walking in faith, to grow, to receive, to rest. And share it with someone else wandering in the wilderness. They don't need directions. They just need to know. There's a better land. And it's closer than they think.